Baghdad. January 17th, 1991. The night was unnaturally quiet. No sirens, no engine roar, just the thrum of electricity in the air, tense, waiting. At an airfield just outside the city, a MiG-29 pilot, trained in the finest Soviet doctrine, hardened by years of drills and Soviet instructors, sprinted toward his jet. Orders were clear: intercept the incoming attackers. He climbed, scanned his instruments, punched throttle, but there was nothing. The radar screen stayed clean, no lock, no tone, and then impact. A distant flash in the sky, a black smear of smoke, and radio silence. Another MiG was gone. No dogfight, no maneuvering, no retaliation. The jet had simply vanished, cut down midair before it could even identify its attacker. Inside the Baghdad control center, Soviet advisors froze. This wasn't the war they had trained for. Soviet air doctrine, meticulously honed over decades, taught pilots to seek visual contact, maintain formation, engage head-on or from flank, and fight with the discipline of a squadron. It was an art of timing, speed, and angles, and above all, it was visual. You had to see the enemy to kill the enemy, but the Americans were not fighting that war. They didn't appear, they didn't maneuver, they didn't even enter the zone of combat in the traditional sense. Their jets struck from hundreds of kilometers away, aided by invisible sensors and airborne battle managers. Soviet-trained pilots weren't even being outflown. They were being deleted. By the time the second wave of MiGs took off, another two were down mid-climb. Not a single American jet had been visually acquired. Not a single Soviet-trained tactic had applied. Soviet observers reported the event to Moscow in disbelief. Pilots did not engage. The message read, "Losses occurred without contact." The implication was unspeakable. The doctrine, the proud, tested, and exported doctrine of the Soviet fighter corps, had failed before the war had even begun, because the Americans had brought a different war to the sky. And the Soviet pilots, they were flying blind into history's greatest mismatch. The Soviet Union didn't just train pilots, it forged warriors in steel doctrine, line by line, maneuver by maneuver, flight after flight. Every MiG pilot, from Vladivostok to Rostov, learned the same truths. Speed wins engagements, formations preserve cohesion, and dogfights are decided by nerves, instincts, and the right geometry. Soviet flight academies weren't producing improvisers. They were producing instruments, skilled, fast, obedient. Cadets spent thousands of hours rehearsing intercept patterns, visual ID drills, and the fine art of the merge, the moment when two aircraft crossed paths in a head-on pass, and the real duel began. They trained for radar-guided direction to the merge, missile salvos at medium range, followed by cannon work and tight loops. The enemy was always visible, the rules were always known, the kill was always earned, and the entire system depended on symmetry. Soviet doctrine assumed American fighters would come at them with similar tactics: speed, altitude, aggression. They believed in mirror warfare, two sides, different gear, but playing on the same battlefield. It was built into everything. MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-29s, even the mighty Su-27, each one was designed for air combat supremacy based on thrust-to-weight ratios, instantaneous turn rates, and a radar detection arcs. Soviet pilots were taught to press engagements, use G-force to bleed energy from the enemy, and rely on visual closure to win. That's why their training emphasized visibility, eye-on-target kills. Why air regiments were drilled to fly in pairs, then fours, then eights. Why command and control was localized. With ground stations feeding targeting orders but leaving the dogfight to the pilot, the enemy would be seen. The pilot would engage. The best would win. But none of those assumptions survived contact with American doctrine in the 1990s. Because the U.S. had learned a different lesson, one Soviet planners ignored. Don't fight the pilot. Kill the aircraft before the pilot knows there's a fight. And when Soviet-trained Iraqis scrambled to intercept, the old truths became traps. Visibility was meaningless. Formations became liabilities, and maneuverability meant nothing against a missile launched from 60 kilometers away, guided by a jet the pilot never saw, controlled by an AWACS platform orbiting hundreds of miles outside the battle. The assumptions weren't just wrong, they were suicidal. The Soviet Air Force's strategic mind was forged in the fires of World War II, refined in Korea, and hardened in the skies over Vietnam. Every iteration reinforced a single, unshakable belief. Air superiority was a contest of machines and men, won through thrust, angle, formation, and resolve. By the 1980s, that belief had crystallized into a doctrine that appeared logical on paper. Fighters would be vectored toward threats by ground-based radar. Intercepts would occur in visual range. Missile salvos would be traded, but the winner would be the more agile, better-trained pilot with superior numbers or surprise. Close-in cannon fire remained essential. G-force discipline was paramount, and situational awareness was expected to come from the cockpit. This is the war the Soviets trained to fight. The MiG-29 Fulcrum and Su-27 Flanker weren't designed to hide. They were designed to dominate. High thrust-to-weight ratios, excellent climb rates, and high alpha maneuvering gave them every advantage in a fair fight. In a world of duels and dogfights, they were born killers. But this vision was already collapsing quietly, invisibly. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. wasn't just building better jets. It was abandoning the idea of symmetrical air combat altogether. Beginning in the late 70s, U.S. Air Force doctrine pivoted. Instead of chasing the tightest turn radius or fastest climb, American strategy began to focus on who saw whom first and who fired first. The emphasis shifted toward beyond visual range BVR engagements. That meant long-range radar. That meant networking. That meant pilots no longer operated alone. AWACS aircraft flying radar stations like the E-3 Sentry gave American fighters a complete picture of the sky instead of reacting to visual contacts. U.S. pilots were given targeting data before they even took off. Entire squadrons were guided into ideal firing positions before the enemy even knew they were being tracked. The F-15 Eagle was the expression of this doctrine. It could dogfight, but rarely had to. Instead, it killed at standoff range, often before being detected. Paired with radar-guided AM-7 Sparrow and later AM-120 AMRAAM missiles, the F-15 was more than an aircraft. It was a distributed kill system. Soviet planners saw this trend, but they dismissed it. They believed American pilots would revert to form once the missiles ran dry. That the fundamentals speed, maneuver, aggression would still determine outcomes. But the new American system wasn't interested in a fair fight. It was interested in preventing one. The air war over Iraq was just hours old when it shattered decades of Soviet tactical assumptions. In the pre-dawn darkness, a squadron of Iraqi MiG-29s took to the sky from Tammuz Air Base. Their mission was standard climb to altitude, form up, and intercept what their ground radars indicated were inbound American strike packages. The lead pilot, trained under Soviet instructors, knew the playbook: follow ground vectors, acquire visual, engage with missiles or guns. He'd drilled it for years. What he didn't expect was death at 70 kilometers, before the MiG could lock radar on anything. The sky lit up. Warning lights, a tone, then silence. An AIM-7 Sparrow missile, launched from an F-15 that had remained undetected behind Iraqi radar coverage, struck the fulcrum mid-climb. Seconds later, another MiG vanished. Then a third, one by one. They were eliminated before ever seeing their attacker. For the first time in modern history, a major aerial force had been dismembered without a single visual engagement. Back at the Baghdad Sector Control Center. Chaos. Ground controllers issued calls for evasive maneuvers, desperate to relocate their assets. But the American fighters weren't circling or diving. They were executing perfect standoff attacks from radar-guided vectors fed by AWACS aircraft orbiting over Saudi Arabia. These weren't dogfights. They were ambushes in one sector alone. 11 Iraqi fighters were downed in less than 30 minutes. 8 of them never locked a target. 3 never armed weapons. 1 never left the runway. Soviet advisors stationed alongside Iraqi commanders were horrified. The doctrine they had drilled for years, visual acquisition, maneuver tactics, mutual support had been irrelevant. Their systems had not failed in a technical sense. Their radars were operational. Their pilots were skilled. But the battlefield had moved, and they hadn't moved with it. Further west, an Iraqi pilot flying a MiG-25 Foxbat had over Mach 2 watched his warning system scream before a radar-guided missile chased him from behind. He never saw the F-15 that launched it. He barely made it back to base. In post-mission debriefs, stunned pilots spoke of missiles appearing out of nowhere and enemies who never showed up. These weren't metaphors. These were facts. America had changed the rules of the air war, and the first impossible event wasn't a specific dogfight. It was the total absence of one. The reports flowed into Moscow at a pace too fast to process. Combat assessments from Iraq, relayed by GRU operatives and Soviet military attachés, told a story no one wanted to hear. American fighters were dominating the skies. Not through heroism, not through superior numbers, but through a battlefield that didn't exist on Soviet terms. One internal summary from January 18, 1991 outlined the unthinkable: no visual contact. Radar locks failed. Enemy aircraft not observed. The Soviets read and reread it, then dismissed it. This is Western disinformation. A colonel in the VVS reportedly claimed, "No pilot can kill without seeing." In a closed-door briefing inside the Ministry of Defense, a general waved the documents aside. The Iraqis failed to follow procedures. Their pilots lacked discipline. It was easier to blame the Allies than admit a fatal flaw in doctrine. They pointed to radar logs. The MiGs had working instruments, one staffer insisted. If they were shot down, they were ambushed, not defeated, but the evidence kept piling up. Engagement after engagement showed the same pattern. Iraqi aircraft scrambled under radar direction. American fighters engaged from over 40-60 kilometers away. Kills occurred before Iraqi pilots could respond, often before they even locked their targets. No visual contact, no maneuvering, no return fire. To the Soviet mind, this was not war. It was murder by machine, because every assumption behind their air combat doctrine required an exchange, a merge, a chance to react. If an F-15 could destroy a MiG without a visual, without a counter, without a fight, then the Soviet system wasn't just losing, it was irrelevant. But Moscow couldn't afford that conclusion. Not in 1991, not while Eastern Europe was slipping away, not while internal unrest churned, and not while the West was broadcasting its supremacy to the world. So they did what doctrine always does in the face of paradigm collapse. They changed the story. Soviet analysts began proposing experimental American weapons or secret electronic warfare. Others suggested Iraqi pilots had defected mid-air. Some insisted the radar data must have been corrupted by NATO signals intelligence. Anything to avoid the truth. That, in a modern air war, it wasn't enough to fly fast, turn tight, or fire second, because the enemy now fought before the fight began. If Soviet command couldn't accept the reality, they would build a theory they could live with. By early February 1991, a new consensus began to circulate through the ranks of the Soviet Air Defense Forces and aviation research institutes. Stealth. They insisted the F-15 must have been using classified, low-observable technology coated in radar-absorbing material, equipped with passive sensors, operating in ways not yet disclosed. That, they argued, is why our systems couldn't detect them. The Americans weren't playing fair, they were invisible. This explanation gained traction fast. It was easy to visualize, easy to fear, and conveniently external. If Soviet radar had failed, it wasn't because the doctrine was wrong, it was because the Americans had cheated physics. But there was a problem. The aircraft dominating the skies over Iraq weren't stealth. The F-117 Nighthawk, the only true stealth platform in operation at the time, had been used exclusively against high-value targets' command bunkers, radar installations, strategic nodes. It wasn't engaging enemy aircraft. The jets that had racked up air-to-air kills were F-15s, F-16s, and F-A-18s. None of them were stealth, and none of them should have been invisible. And yet they were. The Soviet theory began to crack. Radar logs confirmed that F-15s had been present in multiple engagements but never appeared on scope. Visual accounts from Iraqi survivors consistently described being hit from unknown directions, often while climbing or turning based on ground vectors. No visual contact, no threat indicators. The truth was simpler and more dangerous than stealth. The F-15 didn't need to hide. It was simply operating in a kill web far beyond what the Soviets believed possible. Guided by AWACS aircraft like the E-3 Sentry, U.S. fighters received real-time targeting updates. Iraqi radars saw a clean sky, but 300 kilometers away. An orbiting AWACS platform saw everything and relayed that information instantly. By the time the MiGs took off, their fate had already been plotted. The Americans weren't invisible. They were unreachable. And the Soviet radar operators, locked into static grids and narrow-band target tracking, couldn't comprehend what they were missing. Their systems weren't broken. They were simply outdated, designed to hunt formations, not digital ghosts. But Moscow didn't want that answer. It kept the stealth myth alive because it was easier to blame an unknown technology than admit the real cause. The battlefield had moved into the data layer, and the Soviet Union wasn't there. When the stealth narrative began to fray under technical scrutiny, Soviet analysts pivoted to another explanation: missile superiority. If the Americans weren't invisible, perhaps their weapons were simply unstoppable. The AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-120 AMRAAM became the new focal point. Internal reports circulated claiming these missiles had been modified with enhanced seekers, infrared overlays, and signal spoofing systems the USSR had never seen before. The analysis was deceptively comforting. If Soviet fighters were being destroyed in droves, it wasn't because their tactics were flawed. It was because the enemy's weapons had leapfrogged physics again. The MiG-29's R-27 missiles were still powerful, but perhaps outmatched by superior guidance, longer burn time, or next-generation proximity fuses. This theory had a surface of credibility. The AMRAAM was indeed revolutionary. It enabled true fire-and-forget engagements, allowing pilots to launch and break away without guiding the missile to impact. Its onboard radar seeker activated in the final phase of flight, making it nearly impossible for targets to spoof or outrun once launched. But there was a deeper problem with this theory. Missiles don't win wars alone. What the Soviet command refused to acknowledge was that the kill chain, the sequence from detection to destruction, was where the Americans had truly leaped ahead. It wasn't that the missiles were magical. It's that they were fired from the perfect place, at the perfect time, against unready targets. Soviet missile doctrine required pilots to acquire a lock, maintain radar contact, and often close the distance for a higher probability of kill. American doctrine had no such constraint. The F-15, guided by airborne command platforms, could paint the target using shared data, allowing for BVR launches with confidence. By the time a Soviet-trained pilot realized they were being tracked, the missile was already in terminal phase. No last-minute maneuver could save them. No flare could confuse a radar seeker. No jamming pod could fool an AWACS orbiting 300 kilometers away. And even worse, Iraqi pilots began reporting engagements where no missile warning was ever received. They were simply hit. The Soviets scrambled to deploy countermeasures. Flare patterns were reprogrammed, radar operating procedures adjusted. But nothing worked because the doctrine had failed before the missile even launched. The weapon wasn't just the missile. It was the system of detection, coordination, timing, and control. And no Soviet MiG was trained to fight that kind of war. The most devastating failure wasn't tactical. It wasn't technological. It was epistemological. The Soviet Union had watched the evolution of American air power with eyes wide open, but blinded by assumptions. For decades, U.S. investment in data links, airborne warning systems, and digital integration was interpreted through a biased lens, inefficient, overpriced, logistically burdensome. Soviet intelligence estimated that centralized command systems were superior, simpler, more efficient, ground-based radar-fed vectors to pilots, who executed set-piece engagements. No pilot was expected to think beyond their flight plan. Flexibility was a liability, autonomy was risk. But the Americans had drawn the opposite conclusion. They had built an ecosystem where every node fed the others. J-stars watched the battlefield from above. AWACS managed airspace like a conductor leading an orchestra. Satellites delivered real-time weather, radar, and infrared intelligence. Fighters became delivery systems for decisions made long before launch. Soviet analysts noticed the platforms. They never understood the integration. They believed the E-3 was just an airborne radar, not a battlefield brain. They thought satellite comms were for strategic deterrence, not for tactical precision at 800 kilometers. They interpreted the AMRAAM as a faster sparrow, not as the tip of a weaponized information network. They had the blueprints, but not the framework. Throughout the 1980s, U.S. red flag exercises tested these systems again and again. Pilots were taught to act on partial information, respond to dynamic threats, and engage targets they never saw. BVR engagements became the norm. Coordination with command aircraft was drilled until it was second nature. Soviet training, meanwhile, lagged behind. Visual acquisition remained king. Close-in dogfight training consumed the majority of flight hours. Air-to-air missile doctrine assumed first detection came from ground radar. AWACS was rarely factored in because the USSR lacked an equivalent system with the same fidelity and volume. By the time the Gulf War exploded, the intelligence failure was complete. Iraqi pilots trained in Soviet tactics entered a battle space that existed in 3 dimensions they couldn't see. The enemy didn't fight fair because the enemy didn't fight visibly, and Soviet commanders watching from secure bunkers, were forced to admit what decades of assumptions had hidden. They had misunderstood the battlefield. They had misread the enemy. They had miscalculated the future. And no amount of bravery in the cockpit could correct that. To understand why Soviet-trained pilots never stood a chance, one must understand what they were actually fighting. Not a plane, not a missile, not even a squadron. They were fighting a system. By 1991, the United States had operationalized something the Soviets feared but never fully grasped: total information dominance. It wasn't a slogan. It was a structure, a vertically integrated, horizontally distributed, and sensor-fused web of reconnaissance, targeting, and command. At its core was airborne warning and control, the E-3 Sentry AWACS, with its iconic rotating dome and powerful radar array. The AWACS could track hundreds of targets simultaneously at ranges up to 400 kilometers. But it wasn't just a passive observer, it was a battlefield orchestrator. AWACS crews directed F-15s into invisible corridors of airspace, out of enemy radar range, behind terrain, and along precise intercept vectors. American fighters didn't need to search for targets. They were assigned prey already tracked, identified, and prioritized. Add J-STARS, the Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, and the Americans could map moving ground units in real time, add satellites, and they could cross-reference heat signatures, radar reflections, and signal intercepts, add secure data links. And now each fighter wasn't just a jet, it was a node in a kill network. This was air-land battle doctrine, made manifest seamless integration between air and ground, sensors and shooters, command and cockpit. An American pilot, flying at Mach 1 over the desert, could receive threat updates from a satellite, missile lock confirmations from AWACS, and abort commands from a controller 1,000 kilometers away. Soviet doctrine had nothing like it. Their fighters were guided by static ground radars and often overwhelmed or destroyed in the first hours of conflict. Communication was hierarchical. Data was scarce, delayed, or localized. Decisions were made far from the action, and often too late. The U.S., by contrast, practiced mission command, pushing decision-making down to the pilot level, armed with superior intelligence. The kill wasn't just made in the moment. It was designed, pre-approved, and delivered on a digital silver platter. When an F-15 fired an AIM-7 Sparrow, it wasn't guessing. It was executing a chain of certainty built by sensors, confirmed by computers, and enabled by doctrine. And because of this system, American jets weren't visible. Not because of stealth, but because of positioning. Not because of speed, but because of timing. Not because of luck, but because of architecture. The Soviets had built fighters. The Americans had built an operating system. And for Soviet-trained pilots in Iraq, that difference meant the sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a trap. The skies over Iraq turned into a laboratory of defeat. At Al-Taqaddum Air Base, dozens of MiG-23s and MiG-29s sat fueled and ready. Their pilots, many trained in Soviet flight academies, had studied the dogfight, the timing of turns, the physics of energy bleed, the patience of the angle fight. They had simulated aerial engagements against phantoms and theoretical eagles. They were ready for war. But war didn't come. Desert Storm's air campaign unfolded with surgical indifference. On the third night, American F-15s and F-16s launched a coordinated strike with seed support from F-4G Wild Weasels. The first wave never entered radar range. Tomahawk cruise missiles shredded radar stations. The second wave, masked by terrain and AWACS-guided vectors, flew at medium altitude undetected. When the first MiG-29 scrambled to intercept, it exploded before reaching 3,000 feet. An AIM-7 from beyond the visual horizon ended it. Another tried to engage, but his radar was saturated with noise, his RWR screaming from multiple directions. He fired blindly. Nothing connected. The pilot ejected into darkness. Across the base, one Iraqi flight leader aborted entirely after seeing the destruction of the command center. His sortie never left the tarmac. Soviet officers embedded in Iraq were horrified. They had trained these men. The MiG-29s had been gifted as symbols of parity airframes, capable of matching the West. But the kill ratios told another story. By the end of the first week, F-15s had destroyed over 30 Iraqi aircraft, with 0 losses in air-to-air combat. Some Iraqi jets had been struck while taxiing. Others were lured into the air by fake radar returns, only to be bracketed by missiles launched in total silence. There was no opportunity to maneuver, no visual merge, no glory, only the cold logic of systemic destruction. Soviet advisors tried to salvage morale. They urged counterattacks. They drafted intercept routes. They even recommended dispersing aircraft to avoid destruction. But the system they had trained was not designed for improvisation. Iraqi pilots were brave but not flexible, and Soviet doctrine didn't teach creativity under collapse. At one radar command post, a Soviet colonel reportedly muttered, "This is not air war. This is annihilation." And he wasn't wrong, because America wasn't fighting aircraft. It was hunting tactics and erasing them one sortie at a time. The defeat in the air was not just military, it was doctrinal, psychological, and existential. For decades, the Soviet Union had exported its air combat ideology across the globe. From the Middle East to Southeast Asia, Soviet aircraft, training, and tactics formed the backbone of Allied air forces. Every engagement from Korea to Vietnam was seen as a test bed, a proving ground where the merits of socialism's military mind would be validated in steel and speed. But Desert Storm undid all of it in a week. Soviet planners had imagined the next great conflict as a symmetrical contest waves of MiGs, dense SAM belts, radar coordination, visual merges. The Americans had no interest in symmetry. They brought in visibility, coordination, and strike before detection. There was no redemption arc, no glorious comeback, only realization and ruin. In post-conflict analysis sessions, Soviet generals were forced to confront the failure. MiG-29s, even with their superior close-in agility, had never entered visual range. The Su-24 strike platforms had been neutralized before weapon release. Their prized command and control centers, once the nervous system of battle, had been blinded by electronic warfare in minutes. And the ultimate humiliation, the Americans didn't even send their full force. Stealth aircraft like the F-117 had been used sparingly, reserved for key infrastructure strikes. B-2 bombers hadn't even entered the theater. This wasn't the sharpest sword of the West. This was just the opening act. In a closed session held in early 1992, a senior VVS commander reportedly admitted, "We trained to fight the last war better. They built a new war entirely. Doctrinal collapse rippled outward. Warsaw Pact nations, witnessing the gulf in capability, began to question their own military foundations. Eastern Bloc air academies, once proud institutions, now had to teach around defeat. Allied nations, once eager for Soviet aircraft, turned to the West. It was not just a tactical failure. It was the death of a world view. Because the Soviet air doctrine, meticulously constructed, ruthlessly implemented, had failed on first contact with a force that no longer played by its rules, and in that failure, an entire ideology lost its wings. Today, jet fighters roar across skies from Syria to the South China Sea. They climb faster, strike farther, and compute more per second than anything imagined during the Cold War. But beneath the glass cockpits and satellite links, the same ghost lingers. The ghost of a war that never happened because it was over before the enemy understood it had begun. American airpower didn't just win in the Gulf, it rewrote what war meant. The Soviet-trained pilot, conditioned to see war as a duel of equals, became a victim of invisible supremacy. Not because he lacked courage, but because he'd been trained for a world that no longer existed. And that lesson persists. Modern Russian doctrine still bears the scars of that collapse. It speaks of layered air defenses and integrated battalions, but often repeats old patterns, centralized command, visual range assumptions, and reactive control. Meanwhile, the legacy of Desert Storm has evolved into dynamic targeting, real-time fusion, and unmanned coordination. The ghost whispers every time a radar goes dark and no one knows why, every time a command post is struck before it transmits, every time a missile arcs silently from beyond the horizon, leaving only wreckage. And in the end, this was never just a story about jets or missiles. It was about belief. The belief that courage and speed could compensate for information gaps, that training could overcome blindness. That war was still a contest of reflex and resolve. But America didn't come to contest. It came to a race.